As we begin to look at Jesus, this central part of our faith and what we believe, that everything that we believe as Christians is rooted in who the person of Jesus is, we can begin with complete confidence that Jesus really lived and really existed. But who was he? How do we begin to understand who this Jesus was? Well, there are two things that we're going to look at to hopefully help us. And the first one of those is something that we do on Alpha when we look at the evidence for the New Testament. And then we're also going to look at some of the history of the church and how the church began to understand and make sense of this person called Jesus. Why are some of these things important, you might be asking? It's because I want us to be confident that the faith we have is not just a set of made-up rules by a church, but is actually rooted in evidence from history, that we can have confidence of what we believe is true. When I look around the world and I see Christians suffering from their faith, when I see people being willing to die for their faith, we need to know that what we believe is true and rooted in good sound evidence. And to unpack what we believe from the Bible, it's important that we first lay foundations that what we believe is true. And that's what we're doing. One of the things we look at on the Alpha course is how we can trust that what we read in the Bible is true. And there is a science called literary criticism. And the idea of that is this, that if we want to know the source of a historical document, there are some things that we need to identify. And the first thing we need to identify is, when was it originally written? Because the nearest to the events of the time that it's written, the more accurate it is likely to be. The second question we ask is, what are the earliest copies of that manuscript that we have? Because the more time that's elapsed between when the things were originally written and the copies that we have, make it possible for people to have edited and adapted and changed those documents. So the accuracy of what we have is more trustworthy the closer it is to the date of the original writing. But the other thing that we look at is the number of copies of those documents that we have. The more copies we have, the more evidence there is to compare and contrast. And consequently, the more copies there are, the more trustworthy what we have can be taken to be. What we look at on Alpha is that some of the events of history that we grow up with learning in school and are taught as absolutely trustworthy, things like the Romans and the Roman history, things like Caesar and Livy's wars, a lot of those are written in documents from the time. If we take things like Livy, stuff that he wrote was written between sort of 59 BC and AD 17. And there are only 20 copies of that, but we're unsure of the date of some of those. Whereas people like Caesar's Gallic Wars were written between 100 to 44 BC. The earliest copy we have is from AD 900. There's a 1,000-year gap and only 10 copies. Or look at Tacitus, who we often quote, writing around AD 100. The earliest copy we have is from 1100. There's a 1,000-year gap and only 20 copies in existence. The amazing thing is that when we contrast that to the New Testament, we see that the New Testament was written in the 1st century, so between about 50 and 100 AD. The earliest copy that we have in existence is from the 2nd century, and we have fragments from as early as about AD 130, which potentially is as little as a 30-year gap. Certainly, it's less than 100 years. But the incredible thing to realise is that there are over 5,000 copies of the New Testament in circulation at that time. From a scientific criticism point of view, we can be confident that what we're reading has, within literary terms, a 99.5% accuracy. It stands alone as a work of history for its accuracy to what was originally written. We can have confidence that the Bible we are reading and what we are learning about Jesus is accurate to what was originally written. But here is the really interesting part for me. Who wrote the New Testament? We believe the Bible was inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit inspired people to write. But the New Testament is made up of letters, primarily either biographies or letters that talk about people's experiences of Jesus. They were written by people who, more often than not, had had a personal encounter with Jesus. So what we're reading has been written down by people who encountered Jesus because they want us to know what they experienced, what they saw, that they wanted to write it down for the generations to come. When you've encountered Jesus, it's a life-changing transformation. And his disciples, the people, the apostles who wrote the New Testament, wanted us to know what they had experienced. So what we can be confident is what we're reading is accurate to what was originally written, and it was written by people who were with Jesus.